Good morning. We're here for the Aligning CAP and NRL Peatland Perspectives from Across Europe. You'll have heard just recently that we're recording this webinar. So please, if anybody has any issues with that, let us know. The speakers I'm going to introduce to you are as follows. We have Tilmann Disselhoff from NABU in Germany. We have Marilda Dhaskali from BirdLife Europe, EU. Nerijus Zableckis from Lithuania, from the Foundation for Peatland Restoration and Conservation. Pamela Boyle from the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine in Ireland. Antti Mutinen from the Natural Resources Institute of Finland, known as LUCA. We have Ainlinn Nivrian from the National Parks and Wildlife Service in Ireland. And we have Marilda Dhaskali from I've already introduced Marilda Dhaskali. So we have a number of speakers. Now, it's very important. We need questions. We have a Q&A session after the various different talks. So I'm going to introduce the speakers one by one. We'll be discussing various aspects to do with the nature restoration law and how it fits in with the Common Agricultural Policy. And we very much need the audience to participate, both in terms of discussion in the chat and also just leaving us questions. So it'll be pretty much first come, first served in terms of questions. I'll be putting your questions to the speakers after the initial presentations. So let's start. I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who is Tilmann Disselhoff from NABU in Germany. He's recently written an article comparing the nature restoration law with German nature restoration targets, specifically for peatlands. And he is the head of Team European Wetlands at NABU, which is Germany's largest nature organization. It's a very large organization. He's also president of Eurosite and has been involved for many years in various EU nature policy processes, such as protected area, private land conservation, and conservation finance. So when he's not busy planning his peatland and wetland restoration projects across Europe, you can find him bird watching, which I think is fantastic, and tending to his organic no-till garden. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over the floor to Tilmann, and I think you have a presentation, Tilmann. Do you want to share your screen?
Good morning, everyone.
Yes, we can hear you.
That's very good, and I'll try to share my presentation with you. Let me know if you can see that now.
We can see that perfectly. So the floor is yours, Tilmann. I'll let you know if you're going well over time. Otherwise, work away.
All right, thanks, Neil. So thanks for the kind introduction, Neil. I was asked to give you a short presentation on an article, summarizing an article that I recently wrote in German, though, on the NABU site, about the peatland targets in the nature restoration law and how they compare to already existing explicit or implicit peatland restoration targets in Germany, because this kind of gives us a flavor of what the nature restoration law has in store with regard to peatland restoration. I was also asked to say a few words about Eurosite. Neil already mentioned NABU, my employer, the largest environmental NGO in the EU. Eurosite is one of NABU's umbrella organizations. It's a network of neutral site managers and nature conservation practitioners across Europe, not just the EU, also individuals and organizations outside the EU. And I'm honored to be president of the board at this very nice organization. All right, so without further ado, let's dive into the topic of the day. First question is, where can we find peatlands in the NRL? All right, let's see. Yeah, that should be working. So first of all, they play an important role in the NRL, as you probably all know. They are already mentioned several times in the recitals, where the focus is not just on their value for biodiversity, but also on their function as carbon sinks, terrestrial carbon sinks. As you all know, peatlands store a vast amount of carbon, and they can also emit vast amounts of carbon if they're degraded. So you have cross-references in the recitals, not just to biodiversity policy objectives of the EU, but also to climate policy objectives and legislation at EU level. And that's important to understand how the targets in the articles of the regulation relate to peatland restoration, because they're not just listed there as habitat types for rare species, but also as in their function, as I said, as carbon sinks. So we have two articles actually relating to peatlands. First one is Article 4. That's the one that sets targets for all habitat types listed in Annex 1 of the Habitats Directive. So this includes peatland habitat types, but it's not limited to them. And if you go to the list of habitat types in Annex 1 Habitats Directive, you'll find many peatland habitat types that are obvious peatland habitat types. And then there are a few where you could argue one way or the other that they may also contain peatland or peat soils. Now, Article 4 states that all member states have to take restoration measures for the habitat types that are not in a good conservation status, or for that share of the surface of those habitat types that are not in a good, that is not in a good conservation status. And you can see the percentage targets, they're listed by different dates, 30, 40, and 50. So that's the first thing. Now, the second article where peatlands are mentioned is Article 11. And this one is specifically written for peatlands. So this one has an interesting, what do you call it, duality, so to speak, of restoration and rewetting targets for peatlands. So it says member states need to take measures to restore organic soils and peatlands that are under agricultural use. And they have to take measures to rewet them. And you can see that the targets are also, they differ for the restoration and the rewetting part. So until 2030, 30% of agriculturally used peatlands are supposed to be restored, but only a quarter of them should be rewetted. And then they go on, we're in 50% for 2040 and 2050, of which a third should be rewetted. Now, you may ask yourself, how can you restore a peatland if you don't rewet it? And the NRL doesn't really provide a satisfactory answer to that very important question. The only place where we can find a bit of a hint of the what the decision makers are meant is in recital 59, where that describes a range of possible restoration measures for peatlands. And here you can find things such as the conversion of arable land into grassland, the extensification of land use, reduced drainage, paludiculture, and so on and so forth. So you can see that maybe the lawmakers thought of restoration as a continuum and rewetting, and they could be implicitly understood as full rewetting, so water levels up to the surface level as the most, let's say, complete or a consequent form of peatland restoration, and there may be, let's say, partial restoration activities. So maybe that's the way to interpret it, and we'll get back to that later. It's clear that from a climate policy perspective, partial rewetting or restoration without rewetting of peatlands is an unsatisfactory solution to the problem. So the big question now is, we all celebrated the NRL, fine, but does it really add anything on top of what already exists? And that's obviously an answer that I can't, a question that I can't answer for every EU member state. I try to give some hints on what that could mean for Germany, but you may do the same exercise for other EU member states. So spoiler, it really depends on the country. The first thing is our homework to translating these percentage targets of Article 4 and 11 into absolute figures. So what does it mean in terms of hectares for Germany? And in order to do so, I looked at the latest report from the Agency for Nature Conservation in Germany on the extent of habitat types in Germany and their conservation status, because we only want to look at the share of the habitat type that is not in a good conservation status. And then I looked at all the list of habitat types and decided more or less randomly, maybe, with a bit of justification, be counted as a peatland habitat type and what shouldn't. And I won't go into the details of the methodology, but overall, I came up with a figure of around about 90,000 hectares of peatland habitat types that are not in a good conservation status in Germany. And there's a footnote to that. There's also a target about re-establishing ex novo the habitat types that are not in a good conservation status in those areas where they're currently absent. We don't, and that's the idea, is to come to a favorable distribution of overall coverage of the area of that habitat type. Very often we don't have a favorable reference area for habitat types in Germany, so we can't really say what percentage of that is missing because we don't have the absolute desired figure. So I didn't look at that. Second asterisk here is Article 4 doesn't say anything about the type of restoration measures that are supposed to be taken, but we can assume, as I said, that only full rewetting will bring peatland habitat types to a good conservation status. So I assume that the targets here relate to full rewetting and additional auxiliary measures for those habitat types. All right, so what is the result? These 90,000 hectares, well, you can break it down for these percentage targets. We should restore re-wet 16,000 hectares by 2030, 32,000 hectares by 2040, and close to 50,000 hectares by 2050. Now let's compare that to what Article 11 says, because here we look at a different baseline. We don't just look at habitat type, we look at all organic soils, all peatland soils. And this is way more in Germany. We have round about 1.8 million hectares, close to 1.9 million hectares of organic soils or peatland soils, and only a fraction of that could be considered a habitat type of soil. So here we end up with a much larger acreage. We should restore around about 430,000 hectares and re-wet more than 100,000 by 2030. And then you can read out the numbers yourself, but you can see that this is magnitudes higher than Article 4 says. Now, these are not mutually exclusive. So if you restore a habitat type under Article 4 that is in agricultural use, you could also count it under Article 11, obviously. So let's compare that to what we have already in Germany. We don't really have specific area targets for peatland restoration, but we do have indirect targets. And we have two, from my perspective, two major sources for them. One is the National Greenhouse Gas Emission Inventory and Projection Report that comes out, I think, annually by the Environment Agency. And that is based on rewetting and peatland restoration scenarios as part of the LULUCF sector. So they look at what is already being planned in terms of peatland restoration in the various German policies, including the CAP, by the way, and what will come, what is expected, what is likely to be additionally planned in the future. So they look at two scenarios. One is the already existing policy instruments, including the funding tools, and what is the existing plus the soon-to-be adopted policy tools. That's one source. And they just translate that into what that would mean in terms of peatland restoration, hectares being restored. The second source is the German peatland protection strategy. So a national peatland strategy, and that again, it doesn't have hectare targets, but it has an emission reduction target until 2030. And we can deduct from that emission reduction target what that could mean in terms of acreage. All right, so the first one, if you look at the report itself, actually lists the area targets, and it says that around 45,000 hectares of peatland should be rewetted by 2030, and about 140,000 hectares should be rewetted until 2050. So this is under already existing policy instruments. And then they say the projection for additional measures will result in another 40,000 hectares until 2030 and another 380,000 hectares by 2050. So this is not just fancy stuff that could happen, but it's stuff that, like the National Action Program for Climate-Based Solutions, that is already adopted, but it hasn't translated into funding directives yet, funding programs. Okay. And then for the peatland protection strategy, it has a reduction target of 5 million tons of CO2 equivalents until 2030. And now I'm basing the acreage target on assumptions here. We know from data in those reports that organic soils in Germany currently emit around about a bit more than 50 million tons of CO2 equivalents. And we know how many hectares of peatlands we have, so you could just take an average here, but I'd rather base, let's say, my assumptions on an average emission reduction that we can expect from 1 hectare of rewetted peatland. And I think if you take an average of 15 tons per hectare, that's a fair guess. But you could argue either way that it should be lower or higher. Anyway, if you use 15 tons per hectare and you look at an emission reduction target of 5 million hectares, you end up with 333,000 hectares that should be rewetted until 2030 to reach the targets of the peatland protection strategy. All right, let's look at the colorful graph comparing these targets. Here, oops, sorry. I have to move there is a zoom bar so I can see it myself. All right, so you can see that for 2030, Article 11 goes way beyond what is planned in Germany under current scenarios. So that gives us a fairly good boost, let's say. But as things progress, the more interesting target may be the green line, the rewetting, because that's what we want to see at the end of the day. We want to see these peatlands rewetted, not just restored, whatever that is. And as things progress, you can see that current projections for what the effects will be of already existing and planned policy, that will result in a higher rewetting acreage than what Article 11 is. So we have in the long term, targets in the NRL that are less ambitious than what is already planned. That's my main takeaway here. So it reaffirms existing targets in the short term, and it's not quite clear what the effect will be in the long term. The only way it could increase emissions in Germany is if you interpret restoration as rewetting. This is unclear what restoration of peatlands on Article 11 actually means. If you say, because it says at least 1/3 should be rewetted, if you say that at least, is a call to go higher, and pretty much all restoration has to involve rewetting in some form or the other, then it may actually increase emissions in the long term. All right, let's zoom out a little bit though, and then I'll finish up. What does this mean in terms of climate policy overall? Now, this is the latest, those are the latest targets by the European Commission, and they want to turn this incorporate this in the EU climate law with regard to emission reductions. And what's interesting here is the date 2040. They want to reduce emissions drastically until 2040. The land use sector, agriculture, interesting, remains mostly untouched from these emission reduction targets. So you can see that the share of agriculture emissions increases over time, and they want to increase slightly, but still, the sink function, the LULUCF factor. If you zoom into that sink function, however, you can see that the net sink has decreased over the last at least 20 years or so, considerably. So increasing that sink function needs a drastic downward trend in emissions from LULUCF related activities. And you can see that the main cause for the reduction of the net LULUCF sink is the forests. So forests have acted less of a sink as they used to in the past, and that has, among other things, to do with climate change. So depending on what your outlook is, if it's optimistic or pessimistic about the state of European forests, the role of wetland, croplands, and grasslands, and that's where most of the peatlands are hidden, for creating nature-based carbon sink will increase. So we know that the LULUCF sector we have to do something with the LULUCF type sector, in particular about the peatlands. And we also know that in order to reach our climate targets 2030 on European level, we have to restore peatlands by an order of magnitude more than what is foreseen in the NRL. Right. I'll spare you the numbers. I'll link my article in the chat later on. Unfortunately, it's in German, but you can probably use just EPL or another translating website if you want to dive into the details. Right. So the comparison of the area targets on the NRL, the National Peatland Protection Strategy, and those projection reports from our environment agency show that all of those targets are insufficient to achieve the legally prescribed emission reduction targets in the LULUCF sector. The LULUCF's regulation sets a reduction target for Germany of around 30 million hectares of CO2 equivalents per year in 2030. The German climate protection law sets a reduction target of 25 million hectares until then, and 35 until 2040. These targets are in stark contrast to the actual developments in the sector, and as I said, which in Germany, by the way, amounted to a net source of emissions in the last years. So depending on the assumptions made, the reduction in emissions may have to be much higher in the sector if we don't want to miss our climate targets. All right. In view of this challenge, the peatland protection targets in Article 4 and Article 11 provide an important impulse for German policy at the moment. From the perspective of natural climate protection, they can only be seen as a start of an overdue and more ambitious peatland protection policy, and the rewetting of German and European peatlands will be a task for generations, the scope of which goes far beyond the requirements of the NRL. And with that, I'll end my presentation, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tilmann. I hope everybody can hear me okay, because, by the way, Niall Ó Brolcháin, just introduced myself for those latecomers. I'm the chair of the EPPWG, European Peatland Policy Working Group, and it's basically been set up by the Multi Peat project. It's a European-wide organisation, and anybody who's interested in it is welcome to get in touch with us. It's administered by Eurosite, so perhaps Wojciech can put an email into the into the chat just to clarify exactly if anybody's interested in getting involved with us. You know how to get in touch with Eurosite. So thank you very much, Tilmann. Very, very interesting presentation. The sound quality wasn't great, unfortunately, but it was perfectly adequate. So just to say that, because the question has arisen in the panel, so I just wanted to clarify that for people. Hopefully people can hear other speakers a little bit better, although it was quite clear. There was also a point made in relation to the nature restoration targets that you showed, I think, on the first slide from Elizabeth Rams. Elizabeth Rams, and that's that the targets were perhaps slightly out of date, but I think the targets that you showed were related to the article that you'd previously written. Am I correct in saying that, Tilmann?
Yes, exactly. And if there's a clerical error in those figures, thanks for pointing that out, and I'll correct them.
Yeah. So perhaps for the Q&A, we can get the up-to-date peatland targets clarified. Okay, so I'd like to, if I may, move on to our next speaker. We have an excellent set of speakers here today, and from BirdLife Europe, um, we are joined by Marilda Dhaskali. She's the Senior EU Agriculture and Bioenergy Policy Officer. She's leading the Agriculture and Land Use Programme for BirdLife Europe and for Central Asia. It's the European aspect that we want to focus on, obviously. And she's got a background as an agronomist, and she's been working in policy into linking biodiversity for over a decade now, which is great. So it's great to see people who have long experience in policy areas to do with nature restoration and indeed agriculture. So Marilda, would you like
Yes.
to share your slides? Good morning to you.
Good morning, everybody. I don't have slides, as I told you.
Oh, you don't have slides, which is
no.
very helpful. So
Yeah, no, and I will try to be as concise as possible. So because Tilmann, he did a very broad brush and clear of what, I mean, it's at stake within this valuable ecosystems and how actually this is uptaken and will be something important in the nature restoration law. I wanted just to bring more the aspect from the agriculture side, because as you know, the first opponents to the nature restoration law were the big representatives of conventional farming. And they one of the things that they tried to push back was exactly that. It's the need and the requirements to re-wet peatlands. I won't go back to the fact that indeed peatlands are a valuable and commensurable ecosystem from the nature's perspective, but also from the fight against the climate change. And this is, I would say that for us, this is like a common share fact, and I will not go deeper into that. I will just tell you about how this societal issue and concern it's uptaken into the EU policy, and especially on the CAP. The CAP is the Common Agricultural Policy. Why? Because the CAP has a history of driving the destruction and ongoing degradation of wetlands and peatlands, as farmers are encouraged to increase their production and to convert diverse ecosystems into farmland. So still today, the CAP provides a strong incentive for the drainage of peatland. The new CAP, I mean the ongoing CAP, say the way it was designed is supposed to deliver on green and green elements in order to also contribute to this Green Deal and also the biodiversity strategy. So the member states are obliged to show that they have higher ambitions through their CAP to tackle the nature, the biodiversity loss, and the climate change. What we did is that we assessed all the CAP strategic plans. So it's these plans that each member state has to design in order to show where and how the country will distribute, the government will distribute the money. So the and we assessed in 2022. We assessed the CAP strategic plans to see either how they actually are contributing to this objectives, strategical specific objectives for the climate change and biodiversity. And we focused on peatlands and wetlands. So the way the peatlands issue it's tackled within the current CAP and the CAP strategic plans, it's via this cross-compliance, what we say. So it's this, it's the requirements for good agriculture and environmental conditions. So the maintaining of good agriculture and environmental conditions, which is a prerequisite that farmers need to comply with in order to receive their direct payments. So they have to implement these standards for good agriculture and ecological conditions, including for the protection of wetlands and peatlands. Is this GAEC 2. So the GAEC 2 aims to protect carbon-rich soils and to protect the wetlands. The problem is this GAEC 2 so far, it's one of the ones that has barely been implemented by any farmers, actually. So the countries overall, there lack strong actions to safeguard the peatlands. And because there is insufficient data, and the mapping of peatlands are often named as barriers to the early. We are just seeing a status quo of drainage-based agriculture, and this is the kind of we were still doing the business as usual so far. So as an example, for instance, we saw that hearing that my connection is unstable, but okay, there is no issue. So yeah, in Ireland, Poland, and Latvia, for instance, the GAEC 2 will not come into force until 2025. And whereas the current CAP regulation has been enforced since 2023 normally. And the justification for this delay are still questionable, and this will result in more wetlands in the agricultural landscape being destroyed meanwhile. In Denmark, for instance, the GAEC 2 sets the following requirements. So they in the soil. So and it's almost and the no tillage. So the soil, you cannot tillage the soil. So while mitigating the worst negative effects of the dry use of peatlands, these requirements will not strongly cut the GHG from those areas. In Lithuania, the CAP strategic plans still allow for plowing, for drainage, and reconstruction of drainage. In Latvia, you can have a renovation installation of new drainage system, so it's still possible. And in Germany, I think that Tilmann he talked about the German issue and the German situation. But so the main requirement is that GAEC 2 requires that peatlands and wetlands are identified or reported, and this is something that it's really missing in most of the member states. We don't even have a good idea, a good mapping of where the wetlands and especially the peatlands are. So this is from the cross compliance. So this is kind of the mandatory requirement for farmers in order to receive the money. In addition to that, the CAP also foresee the eco schemes. So the eco schemes, it's these voluntary measures that the farmers apply for which they got like premiums, top-ups, and things like that. And so far, none of the eco schemes that were designed by the member states includes, for instance, a scheme for paludiculture. And it's not seen as a way of, for instance, incentivizing peatlands, whereas we know that this is something that some of the farmers that are doing this are they could kind of take, receive some further income, or it can be a business model that is stable. Regarding the second pillar, so the second pillar, it's really payments for improved management of peatlands. and under the agro-environmental measures. This is, again, another support tool within the CAP with potential to fund improved and low carbon management of peatland. But until now, there has been no substantial upscaling of these agro-environmental measures and fundings for peatlands wetting. Good practices example really remain few and far between. So and from all the assessed countries that we did in our study, none of them have plans to spend Pillar 2 payments on measures, which could encourage farmers to shift towards paddy-culture. And so that's a bit the problem, is that we see that from the CAP it's a very important tool to switch farm practices. There is a lot of, and this is what farmers need, it's to have an investment in changing their practices. The measures and the envelopes put for it are still super small and not competitive for farmers. So we won't, and indeed, farmers will not try to implement this kind of measures to re-wet peatlands or to conserve them. So yeah, as a conclusion, after what we saw from this study that we did, is that even if science is clear about the need to conserve and restore peatlands, member states are still lacking strong and appropriate actions to safeguard them. And we can see them in their very this like low ambitions are untranslated in the CAP strategic plans. This GAIC 8 also, GAIC 2, it's still in the current CAP, so it wasn't removed with the recent the recent revision of the CAP regulation that happened in April, May. The GAIC 2, it's still basic requirements, but I mean it's still either weakly implemented or in some cases even delayed. So still thereby contributing to the destructive status quo of peatland drainage. We indeed hope that that member states will still continue to set stricter rules to stop the deterioration of peatlands, and also that now the nature restoration law enforcement and the nature restoration plan will actually be the tool with which member states will contribute and will better take into account the conservation of peatlands. But there is still, I think, a need of education, of advisory system that would need to go and talk with the farmers so they can they can actually be reassured that what they will put into place is going to be beneficial for them, and it's not just going to how can I say that what the other party says, like that this actually will just destroy their business model. There is a possibility to increase and to have a stable business model while protecting peatlands and while shifting to maybe paddy-culture models. I'm sorry, I tried to not be too long. So thank you very much, and happy to have your questions on also the recent developments within the EU CAP regulation. And I'm sorry if my connection was really not good.
Thank you very much, Marilda. I wonder, is it your connection or is there something centrally in Zoom or a problem with the internet? I don't know. Because we did get a question from Torsten Pfennig. Could we please get a text protocol from Mrs. Dhaskali, I presume it is Mrs., and because of many technical interruptions. So there were a number of problems with the presentation for some people. I think I heard you fairly well for most of that now, to be honest. But if you could write something about the key points that we could provide to participants later, it would be great. There was actually 8 people have put a thumbs up to say that they had slight problems, technical interruptions with the presentation. But the good news is that they actually really wanted to hear you. There's approaching 150 participants, so there's a great interest in this particular topic. We're delighted to have here today as our third speaker. Sorry, just get the list. It's Nerijus Zableckis from the Foundation for Peatland Restoration and Conservation in Lithuania. I've known Nerijus, sorry, and I hope I get his name quite right. I'm terrible with names.
Yeah.
He's the founder and director of the Foundation for Peatland Restoration. He's worked in the environmental NGO sector for many years, and he's very experienced in practical restoration. I've seen great videos of Nerijus to prove that point, actually physically going out in the rain to to plant sphagnum and so on. He's very much involved in policy and advocacy, mainly in agricultural policy. So he's a practitioner. And I suppose you could describe yourself, Nerijus, as a peat farmer to some extent. Would that be correct?
Well, depends. Maybe. Yeah.
Yeah. And anyway, I understand you don't have slides either. And what I'm going to do is leave the floor over to you. But again, it would be helpful if you could perhaps after the event give us just a brief report of your main points. We'll see how good the reception is. Hopefully you have a better collection or better connection from Lithuania. Perhaps Lithuania is technically more sound than other European countries. We'll see. So
okay.
The floor is yours.
Thanks, Niall. If the connection will be bad, then I will turn the video, or you can do it. Yeah, so I don't have slides because, in fact, there is not much to say about nature restoration law so far in Lithuania. I don't know if this is the case for other member states, but in fact, Ministry of Environment still did not compile any plans. They plan to make it them in autumn. Start to make them, and what we heard that it will be public process to involve different parties, social groups, and so on. Hopefully it will be this way. But so about in fact, yeah, I cannot tell more because I don't have that information. But what already previous speakers told, and what I can say based on the experience, how of the past years, how it all the support, I mean the voting in the European Commission and Parliament was done. That one thing is that we have, and I can clearly say we have support from the society, from NGOs and so on, because we were actively together with other NGOs, actively involved in the process, and asking politicians, I mean, national ones, and also Europe, the European member, the parliamentarians of the parliament, asked to support the nature restoration law. And yeah, we had also funny situations when the parliamentarians said that they will vote based on their own consciousness and so on, but later on it appeared in opposite, against the nature restoration law. So, but of course, the problem, and the main problem, I think, is the landowners and the farmers, because they In fact, I think all of the different farmer unions, associations, and so on are not in favor of nature restoration law, because even though there are some family farmers or chamber of how it's called, Chamber of Commerce of, if I'm correct in the pronunciation of the name. There are different associations in Lithuania, and some of them are more, let's say, more friendly, a bit more friendly to the nature conservation, but all of them are raising question how nature restoration law will be implemented, where we will, because we are among those countries which have a lot of forests and agricultural lands on peatlands. We in Lithuania, just to remind, we are like size of the okay, to compare, maybe size like Ireland, and we have 10% of peatlands, based on the recent studies, let's say. And half of those peatlands, almost half, are used for agriculture. So meaning that they are like 100% drained. And the nature restoration law, what we heard from Tilmann, that it's a question, what means the restoration, the revetting. It will affect quite big part of lands, agricultural lands, and so all of them are raising that question, also including that generally the landowners are against any expansion of protected areas. Then about few words about the CAP, because the financial source might be CAP, Common Agriculture Policy, but what was already mentioned, that in Lithuania the GAEC 2 is in fact not active, not effective at all, because one thing, that plowing of peatlands was postponed to 2025, and perhaps it will be postponed until late years, because the reason is that there are no maps, reliable maps. And by the way, the mapping of peatlands or databases owned by different institutions, like Ministry of Agriculture is owning one database, which says that there is only half of Lithuanian territory covered in peatlands, like only 300,000 hectares instead of 650,000, because they are using only some part of the data. And still, what is very bad, in my opinion, in Lithuania, farmers have the possibility to prove that peatlands on their land are wrongly indicated by providing samples of peat, like digging peat, and sending these pictures to the agency and saying that, look, there is no peat. So I don't know, perhaps the auditorium are more or less connected to peatlands, and you know that if you dig them, it depends where you do take the sample. So this might be really bad, because in this case, then we will lose a lot of peatlands. And then another thing is what I saw before, one of those reference areas, it was saying that generally the nature restoration law will apply only to 100-something thousand hectares, which is just one small part of all peatlands. I cannot recall exactly, but this reference size was generated by the Ministry of Agriculture at some point. So this is a bit what we have as NGOs should look very carefully. What are the reference levels? Because this might have enormous impact on nature restoration law. And Yes, so, and GAIAC, another GAIAC about renovation of drainage. It's not allowed to install new one, but it is like saying that you can reconstruct, renovate your drainage if it won't worsen the situation, the status of peatlands, which is, again, we had like recent media on like the farmers are doing that renovation, and this is okay. So there are really something, and also we asked so we have like also looking for the CAP and ASCII. There are also measures and the CAP for peatlands, wetlands. And again, the Ministry of Agriculture is always crying there is no money for any extra measure. So again, for the next period of CAP, it will be very difficult to fight for the extra measures for revetting. Also, what I would like to underline, we have in Lithuania RRF measure. This is this recovery and resilience facility after COVID and so on measure. We are only perhaps among few countries which had the revetting of peatlands included as a measure to help in the agricultural sector. And again, it's 16 million euros for 6,000 hectares to restore. And again, due to not really well elaborated rules for the applicants, there was no applications this year. And again, talking about nature restoration law and measures, we have to be very careful, because when we come to agricultural areas, there are it's very complex. There are rules for the applicants, and again, in inventing new measures, we have to be careful to look if these measures are really attractive, and even that applicants who are even motivated to do revetting, that they have possibilities to join and not affect their I know, other payments and so on. Maybe a few words about the National Energy and Climate Action Plan. It is under the in the update process now, and what we saw from the current update, the peatlands are included, but again, at least now they calculate the impact on emissions, and what we also did remarks that impacts are not really, they are not too small, not what, because in Lithuania having so much peatlands, the impact could be much higher by revetting. So this plan is not really in line with the nature restoration law. Maybe last what I could mention is in the LULUCF sector, the peatlands now on revetting or restoration of peatlands are not accounted for IPCC reports. This is a bit a problem, because Lithuania doesn't have a system in place to do that. So there are many things, administrative and also maybe from it is also from mental side to be improved to enable a nature restoration law to come to be implemented. Okay, thanks. Maybe this from my side.
Okay, thanks, Nerijus. And thankfully, your Lithuania does seem to be a good country for technical things. It does seem to be a good country. I heard perfectly your talk, so hopefully further speakers, hopefully we can match that in Ireland as well. Because our next speaker is Pamela Boyle, and Pamela Boyle is from the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine in Ireland. She's an ecologist in the Nature and Land Use Division of the Department of Agriculture in Ireland, and her PhD focused on high nature value farming systems. And she's previously worked in DG ENV at a European level in land use and management unit focusing on agricultural policy. and she's lead coordinator for the Agriculture Ministry in Ireland, inputs into the national position on nature restoration law and national restoration plan. I think that, Pamela, you have some slides to share, am I correct?
I do indeed. So hopefully the technology continues to work, and I'll just try and share here with you. Just bear with me a moment.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Now, hopefully you can see that.
That's actually perfect, Pamela. So I'm going to leave the floor to you, and off you go.
Perfect. And thanks very much for the introduction and for inviting me to participate in the webinar this morning. I'm just going to give a little bit of a flavour of the Irish perspective on how nature restoration law links with the Common Agriculture Policy, particularly in relation to peatlands. Just to set the context first for the nature restoration law in Ireland, our government supported the proposal from its first publication in 2022. Our government saw and continues to see the value of nature restoration for, for societal benefits, for the benefits to environment and climate, and also indeed for the security of food production in the long term. Now, many of our farming organisations have represented concerns, particularly relating to the targets for rewetting and restoration, and indeed in relation to the targets and ambitions of Article 4. But when we look at it in more detail, we see that the targets and ambitions within the nature restoration law actually align quite closely with our existing national commitments under our National Climate Action Plan and National Biodiversity Action Plan, among others. In relation to the nature restoration law and agriculture, of course, many of the other speakers have already cleared this morning, but Article 11 is the primary article focusing on agricultural ecosystems, with targets to increase grassland butterfly and farmland bird populations, increase the stock of organic carbon in croplands, and the share of high diversity landscape features across the agricultural sector. And of course, the targets for restoration and rewetting of drained organic soils under agricultural use. In Ireland, our government has committed to utilising the flexibilities that are there for including action on former industrial peat extraction areas and utilising areas of our state lands to support the delivery of the restoration rewetting targets. Which has been a comfort to some of our farming organisations as well, that they won't only be the only ones carrying the burden to meet this target. But it should be clear that this isn't the only article that requires action from our agricultural sector. Article 4 and Article 10 will require action from the agricultural sector as well. So in terms of the nature restoration law connecting with the Common Agriculture Policy, the CAP is focused on 3 aspects of sustainability. So that's economic, environmental and climate, and social. And then within the CAP itself, we have, of course, the specific objectives broken down into 9 areas. 3 of those in particular for the climate, environment and biodiversity relate very closely to the ambitions of the nature restoration law. And in Ireland, our farmers are already delivering action to support restoration on their farms. Particularly, we see through the successes of the European Innovation Partnerships and our National Agri-Environmental Scheme, the Agri-Climate and Rural Environmental Scheme, which is ACRES. Post 2027, it's hard to know yet just what the CAP will look like. I'll go into this in a little more detail in my final slide, but we expect that focus on sustainability, particularly for environment and climate, to remain. There will, of course, be questions about budget, and from an Irish perspective, to deliver the targets for nature restoration alongside the CAP, the who, what, where, when and how will be particularly important. So we're really looking at clarifying what areas are priority areas for action, who is involved in those areas, what land managers are responsible for those areas, is it state land, is it all privately owned, what extent and what condition are those areas in, and how best to support the land managers in those areas to deliver on the ambitions of the nature restoration law and CAP. So I'm just going to run through some of our current supports. We suspect that should the sustainability focus remain within the next CAP, we will continue to build on these as we've seen that they've been so successful to date. So particularly the European Innovation Partnerships, in the last round of CAP, we had a number of calls for action, and one of those in particular related to peatlands. The objective of this call was to engage with farmers to develop sustainable land management options at catchment level on farms in order to protect and enhance carbon stores, maximise ecosystem service co-benefits, build resilience to climate change, and to explore polludiculture options. So 2 programmes that were particularly successful under that call were Farm Carbon and Farm Peat. Using the information from those EIPs, we scaled up on some of the successes of those and the other EIPs to develop our current National Agri-Environmental Scheme Acres. So this is our flagship €1.5 billion scheme that now has 55,000 participants within the programme. It's built on a general stream and a more targeted cooperation scheme. So within the CP, the cooperation areas, there are 8 regionally targeted areas that really build on the approach of the EIPs that worked, which was locally led, really good engagement, peer-to-peer learning, knowledge transfer. All of those things are built into the Acres Cooperation Programme. And both strands of the Acres programme incorporate results-based agri-payment action. So this means that farmers are paid based on the condition of their habitats on their farms, and this includes peatland area. So to date, we have over 1 million hectares scored using results-based approaches. And specifically for peatlands under the general programme, this is just a screenshot of one part of the scorecard for low input grassland on peat scorecard. So this relates to scoring of grasslands that are managed at a lower intensity that are in close proximity to our raised bog habitats. The farms are scored based on their ecological integrity, whether there's any pressures and threats on the site. And then the farmer is paid a commensurate rate based on the quality and condition of that habitat. And within the CP areas where there's more targeting for particular habitats or species of conservation concern that requires particular management practices, we have over 6,000 herds, so 6,000 land managers involved in the scoring of their peatland habitats, covering a total of 186,000 hectares. So the farmers aren't then solely tied to the condition based on day one. They have the opportunity to uptake non-productive investments and landscape actions that can be additional benefit to the target habitat and species. So for example, for peatland habitats, there may be an option for peat block or drain blocking, but they discuss this with their CP team members. So there really is a more, I don't want to say hand-holding, but definitely more engagement, more opportunity for advice coming from the CP strand of the agri-environmental scheme, which benefits both the farmer and the target habitat, in this case peatlands. So the Nature Restoration Law post-2027, as I mentioned, we expect the focus on environmental and climate sustainability to remain. And in fact, from an Irish perspective, we would probably expect that focus and a bridging of the gap between the polarisation between food production and ecosystem service production to be narrowed if possible. And this would align very closely with the ambitions of the Nature Restoration Law. Under the current CAP programme, we saw that member states really had to be clear about how they were taking the existing environmental legislation into account. So, for example, detailing how their CAP strategic plans linked with their prioritised action framework or the Habitats Directive, Nitrates Directive, etc. And we would expect Nature Restoration Law then to also be accounted for in that accounting in the next programming period. Of course, the CAP is looked on as a significant financial resource for the delivery of the Nature Restoration Law. But considering its 3 priorities, economic, social and environmental, we should be cautious in our expectation. CAP won't be able to deliver all of the ambition of the Nature Restoration Law alone. And it will be on ourselves and other member states to look at other opportunities for funding, either nationally or at EU level. In Ireland, we've seen a lot of success on peatland restoration through LIFE projects, particularly projects like the Wild Atlantic Nature Programme. And our government has committed to supporting a national climate and nature fund of about €3 billion, from which landowners or people taking action for the deliverable of nature restoration law ambitions to draw down from. So that will be a significant support as well in supporting our peatland restoration targets. We should also be conscious that restoration requires long-term action. So while you may be able to restore the condition or put in place measures that will help to restore the condition of a peatland quite quickly or easily, it's the long term that's required. You need the long-term confidence in the landowner that they will have the right incentive, either policy or financial or otherwise, to maintain the restoration action they've put in place for the long term. And the nature restoration law really emphasises that by having the 2050 targets within it. CAP has often been criticised because of the life cycle of each CAP programming period, that it makes it very difficult to put in place appropriate restoration actions. But the NRL then is giving us opportunities to look at other funding streams, particularly private financing opportunities. So some of the attendees today may have also attended the restoration conference that was held in Estonia recently. And one of the main points of feedback that we received from that is that those financial institutions were very clear that there is money available there. We just need to make sure that there's the right type of incentive that's secure and transparent for those drawing down or are benefiting from it, and those supporting the investments for the long term. And that's my short and sweet summary. Thank you very much.
Pamela, thank you very, very much indeed. I will personally have a number of questions for you at the end. I think other people will as well. That was really excellent. Very good summation indeed, addressing the, what we're trying to address here, which is the, I suppose, how CAP and NRL might integrate, in time, because it is obviously a very, very tricky thing. So thank you very much. We'll come back to you if you could stay with us. We'd be very grateful. Thank you. So we tried in this particular, I think as a number of speakers have alluded to, both the Common Agricultural Policy and the NRL, they're not uniform across Europe. There's different aspects at a local level and indeed at a regional level. While they might be the same pieces of legislation at European level, they get put in place at a local level in very different ways. And that's absolutely correct. I mean, the subsidiarity aspect of it is very important. So I'm delighted to introduce our next speaker from Finland, because Finland had quite a bit of political difficulty with the nature restoration law. The government nearly collapsed, I believe, as a result of the nature restoration law. I don't think it was necessarily specifically to do with peatlands, but I think they were related. I think it was more a forestry issue. But our next speaker anyway is Antti Muutinen from the Natural Resources Institute in Finland, LUCA. And Antti was working as a senior scientist in the Natural Resources Institute for some time. His background is in forest economics, and during recent years he was involved in policy support project in which scenarios for the development of forest industries, production of volumes and so on, harvesting volumes, and the LULUCF sectors removals and emissions have been made. So it's good to have a senior scientist from Finland to perhaps give the Finnish perspective particularly. So Antti, have you got slides? Do you need to share them?
Actually, I'm sharing them. Don't you see it?
No, I don't see your slides yet. And I presume nobody else does either.
Oh
so
dear.
Perhaps we can get this.
Let's try again.
Minor technical issue sorted out. Oh dear, that's me, but you're getting there. Yes, the slides are there.
Okay.
So you need to go into presenter mode.
Yeah, there was something.
I think you need to.
So I'll adjust the.
I think that's it. Yes.
Is it now?
Perfect. So I leave the floor to you, Antti, and your 10 minutes, if possible. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for the introduction. And let's go to the forests and how the nature restoration law could affect forestry on peatlands in Finland. And as mentioned earlier, yeah, Finland opposed the nature restoration law in the council. And yes, the government was close to collapse. But there are some reasons behind that. Well, Finland at first is abundant with peatlands. In fact, the Finnish name of Finland, Suomi, the first part of this Suomi means bog or swamp. And we have, well, the current estimate is that about 35% of forestry land in Finland is classified as peatland, and from agricultural land about 12%. And in the case of the agricultural land, although the percentage is quite low across the whole Finland, in some areas, most of the fields are peatlands. And of course, Finland is the most forest-rich country in the Europe. Well, forest industry and production of wood products, they are economically important. For example, 1/4 of Finnish exports of wood are forest industry products. In energy sector, 1/4 of the production of energy in Finland is based on wood, mainly forest industry side streams. And most of the Finnish forests, they are privately owned. There are roughly 600,000 private forest owners, mostly small ones in Finland. So how the nature restoration law is implemented, it can potentially affect quite a lot of ordinary citizens. At first, I have some slides describing the general situation regarding EU policies that affect forests and their use. As we all know, the EU does not have a statutory common forest policy, unlike CAP in the agricultural sector. But then again, there are several sectoral policies that affect or potentially may affect the use of forests. And these policies typically emphasize the forest's role in achieving use, climate and biodiversity goals. And the first von der Leyen's Commission was quite active in putting forward new strategies, new legislation, renewals of existing legislation. There are only listed some of them. And in Luke, we have produced this kind of picture which tries to depict like the different policy instruments that affect forests in Europe in one way or another. So the framework is extremely complex, and having at least some kind of overview of this whole forest policy environment in EU, it's quite challenging. And of course, no one can give any precise assessment of the impacts what all the policy instruments could have in the use of forests. It is nice that in the previous presentations, the objectives of nature restoration law were already described. And as far as forested habitat types are concerned, so the Article 4.1 restoration targets are essential. And in Finland, the Annex 1 habitat types that are forested, there are several of them, but the habitat type Western Taiga, its area is over 1 million hectares in Finland. Then there are the coniferous forests on or connected to the ESCEs. The reported area of this is about 700,000 hectares, but then again, the definition that is used in Finland, it has been changed, and probably in the future, the reported area of coniferous forest on SKs, the total area will be probably 1.5 million hectares. And then there are the bog woodland, and this is the largest reported habitat type. Its area is 1.9 million hectares. And there has been made some studies about the restoration needs in Finland, and a range of from 2 to 6 million hectares has been presented. And as mentioned in previous presentations, there's a question of favorable reference areas. They have not been determined, and there are huge knowledge gaps, for example, in the condition of habitats. So the condition is not known. And of course, in forested ecosystems, restoration measures shall take place also outside Annex 1 habitat types. For example, there's the Article 12 and the criteria and the indicators for forest ecosystems. So restoration activities are needed also outside the Annex 1 habitat types. And for a short recap, so the nature restoration law, despite Finland opposed it, came into force about 3 weeks ago. And there were some modifications in the final version. For example, new flexibilities were introduced, and also derogations taken into account, for example, the renewable energy projects and food security. And what happens next? Within 2 years, member states should submit their drafts of national restoration plans, in which they describe how to meet the targets and in which areas the restoration measures will be targeted. And then there is also the requirement that by 2030, at the latest, the condition of habitat types is known for at least 90% of the area. And this is very challenging in Finland because we don't have the precise geospatial information. The information is available in protected areas and in some extent to Natura 2000 networks, but huge areas of the, for example, Annex 1 habitat types are outside of Natura 2000 network. And the estimates in the areas of the habitat types, not to mention the condition of the habitat types or their location, it is more or less unknown. And the estimates provided in Habitats Directive's reporting is based on the Finnish Natural Forest Inventory sample plots and to large extent to expert assessments. A couple of words about the economic impacts of the nature restoration law in Finland. Nationally, there haven't been any assessments of the positive effects, for example, the biodiversity benefits. Of course, in the longer run, when the process of making restoration measures goes on, there will be biodiversity benefits, positive health impacts, and so on. There will be also positive employment effects, for example, in the restoration activities themselves, and probably within nature tourism. And quite a lot of discussion that has been going on in Finland deals with the negative impacts show the costs of the restoration. And the latest assessment was published in the beginning of last year, and it was estimated that the restoration costs by 2050 could be somewhere between 30 to 90 billion euros. And these restoration work, what was included, covered both Article 4.1 and Article 5.1 habitats. But again, because there aren't the favorable restoration areas, that was excluded. And of course, quite many other targets of the nature restoration law, for example, the restoration targets for urban ecosystems, pollinator populations, or for example, Article 19 and 12 indicators, they were not included in these cost figures. But basically why the Finnish government opposed nature restoration law in the council was the high costs. And already during in the original impact assessment of the commission, the costs per capita were by far the highest in the case of Finland. So restorations costs related to actual work costs, they have been estimated. However, larger scale impacts of restoration activities for Finnish economy, they have not been comprehensively studied, but there is quite a recent study of the effect of the increase in strict conservation area of forests and the annual impact on value added of increasing forest conservation would be between 200,000 million euros, or maybe over 1 billion euros yearly. So these costs are naturally on top of the actual restoration work costs. Well, I already said earlier that 35% of Finnish forestry land is classified as peatlands, and of growing stock, these peatland forests account for roughly 1/4 of the total Finnish forest stock, and the same applies also to the annual yield. So peatland forests are important for Finnish forestry. And peatland forests, they belong to several habitat types of Annex 1 in nature restoration law, but by far the largest type is bog woodland. And in the latest Finnish report, the area of bog woodland that is in good condition was below the half of the total area. Mostly the bog woodland areas that are reported, they are undrained, but also drained forest belong to this habitat type. However, we don't know how much of drained forest are reported under bog woodland. Then again, bog woodland, it overlaps with other Annex 1 habitat types. And the question of the favorable reference area, how large should that be? Well, draining of peatland, it was very active during the 60s and 70s. It was supported by the state. And an estimate is that bog woodland area in 1950 was over 4 million hectares. So currently the reported area is less than half of that figure. So obviously the favorable reference area is larger than the reported area of bog woodland. Well, restoration measures of bog woodland, it could include both active, of course, and passive restoration measures. And in fact, these both ways are now in practice in Finland. So restoration measures include that ditches are filled, and also there are programs for strict conservation of forested peatlands. And can restoration and forestry coexist? Some kind of consensus seems to be that at least the best sites, which are natural or close to natural, they are undrained, they should be left totally outside forestry activities. And in fact, this is already being supported, for example, by Finnish forest law, certification systems, both PFC and FSC, also environmental guide of Metsähallitus, which is the body that manages state-owned forest, as well as best practices for sustainable forest management in Finland. And outside the best site, also continuous cover forestry could be an option. And some synergies could be also achieved because restoration measures that take place on peatland forest, they are important considering the whole drainage basins and the restoration targets of freshwater habitats, which again are very abundant here in Finland. However, impact on wood availability is uncertain. Of course, we don't know what kind of restoration measures should take place in various parts of the country, in what sites, what are the actual hectares of bog woodland, and in what condition it actually is. But the reported hectares, so the 1.9 million hectares, it is estimated that they are mostly undrained and perhaps they are already currently outside wood production, but we don't know that. And only 12% of the reported area of wood bogland currently belongs to Natura 2000 network. Well, this slide is based on a recent study, and I collected some figures from that study which concentrate on the wooded bog woodland habitat type, and it is estimated that in order this particular habitat type would reach favorable conservation status, in 1 million hectares, some kind of restoration activities should take place. And currently we have here in Finland the state-funded Helmi program, which is particularly targeted to restore peatlands, and there the target is firstly to protect 60,000 hectares and then to restore about the same area of peatland by 2030. And you see that there is a huge gap in the targets of Helmi program. And the estimated...
Antti, can I just
yes.
give you a time check, if
yeah.
that's okay?
Yeah, this is the last slide. And it is also estimated what kind of impacts the restoration measures, if they are such that the pesticides are left aside, and in other areas there will be a shift towards continuous cover forestry, and the restoration area is 1 million hectares. This would mean that the decrease in harvesting volumes would be about 2.2 million hectares annually, and the decrease in gross income from forestry would be about 82 million euros annually during the first 10 years. And well, because most of the forests are privately owned forest from these decreases was estimated to be about 90%. So are the private forest owners to be compensated for the losses or not? It is also a question for the political processes which will eventually have to be dealt with. And the other references, if you are interested, unfortunately, these are only in Finnish. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Antti. That's excellent. I mean, it's really, really important as we see to see the different perspectives from the different countries. As we're running short of time, I'd like to go straight to our next speaker, who's Onle Nivrian from Ireland. Are you there? Yes. Onle is saying under time pressure. Onle, can you unmute yourself?
Yes, can you hear me now?
Perfect. And you
Yeah.
have some slides to present, I think, do you?
I do indeed. Now, I've been kicked out of the meeting several times, so hopefully
That's
I'll be able to
unfortunate.
stay in long enough to get going. There we go. You can see those now, yes?
No. Yes, they're coming. They're coming. They're coming.
Perfect.
Yes, perfect. So the floor is yours. And I know
Thank
you're
you
under
very
time
much.
pressure.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, my presentation is very different. It's not on peatlands as such. It's a much more high level but wider look at nature restoration itself. My role in NPWS is sort of coordinating the plan across all of the government departments impacted, rather than delving directly into any one particular article. But I think it's useful to see, you know, sometimes you're concentrating on one area like peatlands. It's useful to see the sort of the enormity of the NRL ask. So this first slide, I use it in every single presentation I do, because it's a very short sentence, but if you look at the meaning of the words: continuous, long-term, sustained recovery, those are massive undertakings across any of the ecosystems we have to look at. And it says across the EU's land and sea areas. Well, that's everything from the Arctic Circle to the Mediterranean, and from the Black Sea to the mid-Atlantic. So just to give you an idea of what that looks like from an Irish perspective, we're all worried about the land and the peat and all of that, but our marine area is probably 7 times bigger. So that's just to give you a flavour of what the enormity of what we have to face in the next couple of years. A quick slide on the timeline. As we said, the Commission proposal started in June 2022. We're now in September 24. So that's 2 whole years just to get to where we are. So while it's an enormous piece of work, it wasn't just thrown together very quickly. It took a lot of time to get us to where we're at. What's in it? There are 7 discrete ecosystems: the terrestrial, marine, urban, connectivity of rivers, pollinators, agricultural ecosystems, and forest ecosystems. Now, they are not standalone. When we think about peatland, we automatically think about Article 11, the agricultural ecosystems. But we've also mentioned here today, other speakers have mentioned Article 4, the terrestrial ecosystems, because they are intrinsically linked together, the actions from one onto the other. Also in it from an Irish perspective, and also indeed our colleague from Finland mentioned as well, that the forest ecosystems is built on peat soils as well. So straight away you can see that you cannot deal with one ecosystem at a time independently or discretely of the others. They are just so interwoven. So when we talk about measures, we have to have an eye to the greater impact that measures in one area will have on the other. So what do we have to put in our plan? And I'm sorry if I'm galloping through this. Well, to quantify and map the areas to be restored. So where is the area that's in not good condition that needs to be restored? Set a baseline. How bad is it? Where are we starting from? So that we know by 2030, 40, and 50 that we have an improvement. Set out the targets to reach those improvements, carry them out, monitor, record, and report. Easy, yeah? Not at all, because when you dig down into it, we have to look at the detail of each of those sentences. Where is the nature restoration? Where does it need to happen? And I think our colleague from Lithuania mentioned a problem with the mapping and different agencies having different versions of mapping. So even determining where this work has to take place is a massive piece of work. Identifying the short, medium, and long-term measures and actions for inclusion in the plan, because there's a lot of measures that are probably better will yield a better result, but they're not going to do it immediately. So we've got to look at what can we do in the short term stopgap, but also what are the long-term measures that really won't show results for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, because that's the sort of nature of measures we need to be putting in place. Then how do we monitor these measures? Are we sure that the measures we're putting in place will actually work? How do we stop, review, and decide that, well, actually something that was working up to 2030 is no longer appropriate because some measures have worked and therefore we no longer need them, some are not working, and so on. So that whole constant piece of monitoring and evaluating, it's not just a 2030, 2040, and 2050, but that is a legacy, nearly an ongoing piece of work that will continue long after the plan is written. How do we determine incentivize the measures? And this, I suppose, is the critical thing. How do you get public buy-in? Yes, public opinion helped us in terms of getting the nature restoration across the line. Everybody likes to think it's a nice idea until it impacts their pocket. So where do we need to get the sweet point where they incentivize so that we can sort of push the measures along and increase the speed at which the measures and actions are taken on board. Now, you have to do all of that while at the same time ensuring no deterioration. So we cannot be focusing on improving one area while taking our eye off another area that actually slides back. So a lot of plate spinning. Now, those were all the sort of the scientific nature-specific related issues to face. This one here is showing you the areas outside of nature itself, sort of more indirectly outside of the nature restoration law, the socio-economic impacts and benefits. So, for example, if we take in Ireland, an awful lot of our land is privately owned, and there's a lot of farmers on it. So you're talking about telling a farmer to farm differently, and that is not an easy thing, an easy conversation. So how do we show that there is a positive benefit to doing things differently? How do you show basically that it's not going to cost, that there is actually a profit to be made? Because it will all come down to money, and I'm sorry, but I'm not a scientist, I'm a bit of a realist, but it will come down to how can we make this work in a positive way so that everybody thinks they're getting something out of it and not just the altruistic improvement of nature and ecosystems. We talk about the synergies between climate action, climate change scenarios, national adaptation, and also we talk about the synergies. We look at synergies between things like the common fisheries policy and the common agricultural policy. Now, the one thing I would say about the word synergy is where there is an action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So where there are synergies, there will be conflicts as well. So while it'll be great that if we can identify measures and actions that, while they're predominantly or primarily for nature restoration, they also have positive benefits on things like climate action and sort of national energy and climate plans. But we've also got to watch out for actions under one of these pillars that actually is detrimental to the other. I can give you a very, very basic example. Everybody wants green energy, so we put up wind turbines. But if you put them in the wrong place, it can be absolutely devastating to migratory birds. So there's an example of where a positive action for sort of national energy and climate actually has a negative action for biodiversity. So we have to watch out the links, the synergies, but also where things are going to conflict and where the compromises are going to have to be made. And no, I'm not for 1 minute suggesting that we stick wind turbines up in migratory routes, but you know what I mean. It's that whole idea that where there will be positives, but there will be negatives as well, and these are all equally valid ambitions. To climate action, green energy, but nature restoration. But at some point we have to look at where they're rubbing against each other and make a decision. And then finally, how do we finance all of this? It'll have to be a mixture of public funds, private funds. The Commission have said there will be no new fund, but once the negotiations start on the next multi-annual financial framework in 2027, there may be an opportunity then to look at that again. And I know it was certainly around the table when this was going through the council, it was definitely a deal breaker for some member states that there was no financial package coming with it. So I don't think that door is closed yet. And what is my last slide, I think? Oh yes, these are the couple of slides on specifically on peatland. Now, most of the stuff you will have heard from my colleague Pamela. In relation to these are the targets for 2030, 2040, 2050, what needs to be restored, what needs to be rewetted. In relation to what do we mean by rewetting, the definition in the regulation is really, really loose. It says a process of changing a drained peat soil towards a wet soil. Now, that means that each member state has the control over what we mean. So, for example, from an Irish perspective, we can mean rewetting can mean one thing in a commercially harvested peat bog site. We can do one thing. However, it can mean something else on an active farm that's producing food. So we have the flexibility to determine for ourselves where rewetting takes place and what degree of rewetting takes place in order to show an improvement in the quality of the soil and the quality of the peat and a movement towards restoration. In Ireland, we will be using the article around restoration being allowed in peat extraction sites, and to that end, the government approved in 2020 a massive fund of 108 million for large-scale peatland restoration projects. This means that there is sufficient capacity within state-owned lands in Ireland to reach the 2030 targets and beyond. Now, that sounds like a bit of a contradiction because the aim of the article is to restore the peatlands in agricultural use, but we can reach our targets without touching any of the peatlands in agricultural use by using the state-owned lands. But to me, that's a window of opportunity, because what that does is it takes the pressure off us. We can reach our targets for 2030 and satisfy the needs of the Commission and the regulation. At the same time, we have a window of time to build on the restoration message, to engage with farmers, to develop new and innovative ways to enable us to then start meeting the rest of the targets on privately owned land. And I just mentioned there, talking about engaging with the farmers, one of the most important things from our point of view is public participation. It is a requirement of the plan. I know there was a whole article devoted to it originally, which was removed, but it's still a requirement of the plan that there's public participation. It's an obligation to Aarhus anyway, but in Ireland it is a government commitment that the plan will be, there'll be stakeholder led, it'll be transparent, and there'll be a huge requirement from landowners to actually contribute to the content of the plan. And that's it. And I said, apologies for gambling through this, but I have to be somewhere else.
Thank you very much, Ainley, and we're very grateful to you for gambling through it indeed, because we only have a short time for questions. So I'd like to invite all. I think Suzanne Nally is joining us as well from your department, and as one of the speakers. I'd like to invite all of the speakers to switch on their switch on their pictures anyway, and I'd like to address one or two questions insofar as possible to the various different speakers. I think we'll try and keep it focused, and people please try and answer within just a short period of time, if that's okay. I'd like to address the first question to Pamela, if that's okay. I think one or two other people might want to answer that as well, but I have a question from an Irish TD or Member of Parliament called Michael Fitzmaurice, who should probably be quite familiar with, who's asked, will the CAP budget and the nature restoration law budgets be interlinked, or will they be completely separate? Are there separate budgets from the point of view of farmers, or is there some sort of linkage between those two?
Well, as Anla highlighted in her presentation, there's no new financing mechanism indicated from the European institutions specifically for the nature restoration law. So it will be up to the member states how they fund the ambitions and the delivery of the ambitions of the nature restoration law within their countries. As I mentioned, and I hope was clear in my presentation, Irish farmers are already delivering for nature restoration, not just for peatlands, but for other habitats as well through the supports in CAP. But it will be, CAP can't deliver everything that the nature restoration law is asking for. So yes, there will be some elements within the CAP in Ireland that will help support the delivery of the ambition of the nature restoration law as there is already, but it won't be the only funding instrument that will have to be used. And in terms of both being interlinked explicitly, I don't see that happening. I haven't heard any suggestion that would be the case, but I am happy for any of the other participants to indicate if they've heard otherwise.
Yeah, because we'd like to see that across Europe. I don't know if anybody else will be aware of that. Any other speakers like to venture an opinion on that? Nerijus or Tilmann or anybody? I don't know if you're party to the budgetary arrangements of the specific governments. The fear, I think, the danger is that the budgets there will be huge pressure put on CAP for nature restoration, and it'll lead to the inevitable endless conflict between nature organizations, environmental policy groups, and agricultural policy groups. So I can see the logic in that, and if there is separate funding, it kind of alleviates that burden a little bit. We had a question from Casper Berver, which I'd like to put, and I'd like very quick answers to this, please. They're looking really at which member states would you expect to indeed progressively start rewetting their peatlands now that the NRL has become a reality. I don't want this to be a name and shame, just which states are likely to be the ones which are going to lead the way in this. And I think that's perhaps, I don't know who'd be the best person to answer this question. Perhaps Tilmann might be the best person to address this question. And you might not have the answer to that, Tilmann.
I can try to answer it from Germany, and I hope you can all hear me well. Apologies for the sound quality issues. So Germany has indeed started to address this even prior to the NRL, and I tried to point that out in my area target comparisons. The action program for natural climate solutions, or whatever you want to call it, foresees significant funding for peatland restoration. It's part of the coalition treaty that is now already a couple of years old. We are still waiting for the most relevant funding programs to be formally adopted and published. We are hopeful that 2 of them related to peatland will be published next week, as a matter of fact. The biggest chunk of money, however, supposed to go to farmers and landowners to compensate them for foregone income losses related to peatland rewetting. Under agricultural use, that funding program is still pending. So the entire action program has started with very high hopes from the conservation sector, and we're still hopeful, but also running out of time.
Yes, we're running out of time in this webinar as well. So yes, maybe I'd just address to you. You've really answered for Germany. I think Pamela has already addressed that, and indeed Ainley for Ireland. Nerijus, do you think that Lithuania is going to be quite proactive in this area, or not really?
Depends on the election results. The party, and indeed, because now there is a complete mess ongoing here, maybe like in all other countries, and the restoration, the plan for NRL, the ambition will depend on the parties, and then we will see if we maybe who knows, but most probably I'm a bit more hesitant to say that.
So in the words of Oasis, definitely maybe. I think it was Oasis anyway. Definitely maybe. Okay, so Antti, what about Finland? Do you have any sense about peatland restoration? Is it going to get any traction?
Well, it is ongoing, for example, within the Helmi program, but the areas are small compared to the actual need. And when it comes to rewetting agricultural peatlands, so the last government made a reservation for funding, for example, paludiculture, but the current one withdrew all the money.
Yeah, so paludiculture, and perhaps the information given to us by various people that individual countries will approach it in different ways. So that leads to a question by Gary Goggin, which I'd like to address to Pamela if possible. Which is to do with the to what extent. Oh, sorry, I better go to the question because I've lost the Gary Goggin. Lost my train of thought here. Sorry about this. Yeah, so sorry, just to mention while I'm going, the questions and answers, just if any of the people listening would like to write answers to the questions, that's any of the participants, feel free to do so, please, because it's open to people to add answers. Different people have different views from different countries. So let me just get this question from Gary. Okay, he's talking about GAIAC 2 across Europe, and he's saying, what is the level of oversight and enforcement in relation to GAIAC 2 across Europe, and how are farmers supported to achieve baseline conditionality? I think you might be able to answer this for Ireland. I doubt well, I don't know if you'll be able to answer it for all European countries, but you might be able to answer it to some extent, Pamela.
Yeah, I guess at a high level, every member state has to report back to the European Commission about how they're delivering the targets for the CAP through the CAP indicator monitoring and reporting process. So that includes the deliverables of the cross compliance, including GAIAC 2. For Ireland, like similar to some of the other member states, and as Marilda touched on, we're in their bad books that due to limitations with our data availability and mapping, we have deferred the deliverable of GAIAC 2 to 2025. So that's where the Irish position is at the moment.
Okay, thank you very much. Does anybody else have a sense on that? Tilmann, perhaps? Do you have a sense on what level of enforcement? I think you might probably reside in the skeptical area, like many people. I could be wrong on that. Most NGOs tend to have a bit of a skeptical view on this.
Take a question, level of enforcement?
The level of enforcement of GAIAC 2 in particular, yeah, for restoration of peatlands.
I have no idea.
No idea. Okay, and anybody else got a view on this? Yeah, no. Okay, I'll move on. Okay, so other interesting questions. We've got a lot of interesting questions in the chat, and as I said, I just repeat that if anybody before the end, which is only in 4 minutes, wants to answer any of the questions, please do so. There's one addressed to Antti in particular, which is, it is useful to estimate the costs of negative impacts, but it is always quite misleading when their benefits are not estimated by any study. So it's sort of a comment stroke question. Do you want to address that one, Antti?
Yes, of course. This is the situation. So also the benefits should be estimated, and I quite confident that there will be more of these benefit assessments made here in Finland as well. But of course, we know we are talking about quite often different types of euros, so the costs are easier to assess than the benefits, that they are typically non-tangible, for example, and they are non-market based as well.
Okay, thank you. I've one for Nerijus, which is from Hendrik Seltzner. I think he's already answered it in the chat, but I'd like to get a verbal reference as well, which is he's asked, peatland emissions in Lithuania are generally not accounted for in IPCC reporting, or is it not clear how much is coming from peatlands in Lithuania?
No, they are accounted, the answer, but only rewetting impact is not accounted That's the problem, because all the restoration efforts are not reflected in the IPCC reports.
Okay. And I might address that to Pamela as well. I mean, are you aware of the, the accounting situation in Ireland? I don't know if you are or not. I understand that the cutover peatlands, for example, may not be properly accounted for.
Unfortunately, I'm not the expert in this area. Fortunately or unfortunately. So I wouldn't be able to give a distinct answer on that. But just to say that the IPCC, one of the other questions that came up there from Evelyn about the IPCC and the national inventory figure changing. We are doing a lot of work with our other government colleagues and agency colleagues to identify the most stable figure that we can potentially use for the accounting here. So our national inventory figure was reduced in the last reporting cycle based on new evidence. So we're considering that at the moment.
Great. I would just say it is very difficult to account for peatland emissions, very difficult indeed, especially when you don't even know where the peatlands are necessarily in some countries. And Multi Peat project, which is organizing this webinar, is trying to address that insofar as possible with estimates and mapping the different peatlands across Europe and providing information on that. I don't know if
Neil,
yes.
if I may, there's an interesting publication I'll add it to the chat about that looks at emission hotspots from peatlands across the EU, and it also compares national inventory estimates to estimates that they derive from. I won't go into the details of the methodology, but the main message is that the national inventories severely underestimate emissions from peatlands. So some of them are not yet covered.
Okay, thank you very much. We've come to the end of our time. So the last thing I just want to address is somebody asked, Torsten Fenig asked an off-topic question. What does the Irish harp symbol stand for? That was on Pamela's presentation, and I think maybe another ones too, Ainley's. And of course, you'll find that on the back of the Irish euro. It's the national symbol from Ireland, and I think it's the Brian Boru harp in Trinity College in Dublin. That's depicted on that. I think all countries have their own symbolism on the back of the euro, which is, I think, a great thing. So, it's lovely to have this conversation European-wide, and we've certainly proved that one size does not fit all. Every country has their own particular set of problems, their own particular set of solutions. But nevertheless, the European idea of giving a common framework certainly does have a significant impact. So it's been a great webinar. I'd like to thank all of our speakers today, and especially those who stayed with us to the end, and certainly the participants who are still with us. So we will share the information. We'll share as much information as possible. We're going to try and get all the slides that were presented today, and indeed publish the video of the webinar. So thank you very much indeed for participating, everybody, and we will finish roughly on time. Thank you.